Hello, this is Ken Ferrie with this week's Boots in the Field report. Good to be back in the saddle. Fishing in Canada was great, except for the smoke, but they're pretty dry up there. Hence the fires that they're dealing with. Water levels were pretty low, making some challenges moving around in the channels. But man, the fishing was good, and that's kind of been the story every time we go up there when the water levels are low. My theory is it's less square foot of water per fish and it makes them easier to catch. At least that's my story and I'm sticking to it. But fishing was great. Man, there was a few days by the time we got the fish back to the cabin, they're already smoked for us. The smoke up there was tough. So situation where I feel sorry for you thought it was bad here. For some of those Canadians, it's got to be pretty rough up there if they're dealing with that day after day. Here at home, things have been bumping right along as we got back. A lot of side dressing going on. Nitrates are coming in good still, so I like to see that. It's looking to be a good nitrogen-friendly year out there. The soybeans, if they're through the carbon penalty, they're now rocking. If they're not, they've been stalled, and they haven't changed much in the last 10 days to 2 weeks, actually. Some of that carbon penalty is being tagged up with some herbicide carryover, as well as some of the high pH areas in the field. They're showing up as well, meaning that the pockets are really yellow in some of those situations. I think they'll slug through it, but it has kind of slowed them up. As far as the insects go, we're in pretty good shape there. We're at about 50% hatch on that rootworm, so we'll be start doing those floats here in another 10 days, 2 weeks. Army worm are going to start feeding, so let's stay on top of that situation, especially in your cover crop fields or fields next to wheat fields, things like that out there. Going to spin around here and spend some time with Matt Duesterhaus over at our Quincy location over there and see how the crops are doing over there. Okay, we're talking to Matt Duesterhaus, who runs operations for us on the western part of the state with Ursa Co-op over there. Matt, how are things looking over there?
For the most part, crops here are looking pretty good. We've got a lot of corn with good stands. Beans, kind of like you guys, we've had some issues with a little bit of herbicide damage, a little bit of cool wet weather. So some beans were kind of stitched in and together and lower stands. But overall, I'd say the crop looks pretty good. We have been getting some rains recently. We need some more heat and some more sunshine, because some of the wet areas are starting to show up a little bit. We've got some pale spots in the bean fields showing up. Same thing in the corn. And on the bean side, we're actually seeing some of these a little bit later planted beans locked up in the carbon penalty, and just seems like they're not moving.
Yeah, kind of seeing the same thing over here where we got a lot of yellowing going on within the bean fields and especially iron chlorosis. The beans are caught in the carbon penalty and dealing with iron chlorosis. They're getting pretty aggressive in how yellow they're getting the last few days. I guess, kind of like you say, rain and maybe some sunshine and a little more higher temperatures keep pushing them along.
Yeah, these later planted beans, and I'm saying later, the end of April and first part of May, seems like they're just not to that V3, V4 stage. They're not making enough nitrogen to overcome that. But the earlier beans, if we were April 10th or 20th or before, seems like they kind of made it past and through that and are starting to take off now. So definitely a difference there on the planting date on beans that we always talk about. The one thing that does have me a little bit concerned is how far behind we are on GDUs. I look, just compared to last year, we're about 120 growing degrees behind last year. So that's slowed down our crop a little bit, I think, on the corn and the bean side, and we'll see if we can make that up or not.
Yeah, I've been watching the potential for our armyworm hatch as we caught moths there earlier in the year, and compared to 11-year average on armyworm right now, we're about 100 GDUs behind. So it's kind of, delayed them as far as they're going to start showing up this week. But scenario where you get that one warm day and you forget that you've just had three that were, lucrative, pretty cool nights, that type of thing, and not enough to push these beans as fast as we'd like.
Yep. One other thing I've been getting a few calls on or seeing a lot of is the yellow whorls out in the field, kind of sporadic. That rapid growth syndrome. We saw a lot of that the first week of June, June 3rd, 4th, 5th. That was really poking out. When those started, you can find those plants still that are kind of wrinkled and the leaves were wrapped up early. And basically, just when they finally unrolled after a few warm days, those random whorls were yellow. And by this time, most of those have already greened up and you can't really tell out in the field if they're still there. But, that rapid growth, it's somewhat tied to genetics, and there's some varieties that definitely showed it more than others, but also a little bit of herbicide interaction there, because we can see it show up on certain sand ridges and things where the rate of the herbicide of our group 15 might have been a little higher for coarser or lighter soil than the rest of the field.
Yeah, as we walk the fields here, and the amount of calls coming in dealing with some of the herbicide carryover issues, some of our overlap zones and stuff showing up in the field that we didn't see 2 weeks ago. And again, I credit to the carbon penalty on top of it, but I did not anticipate that we'd see this much flash of the herbicides from last year, much less we always deal with in-season drift and those types of things. But are you seeing much herbicide carryover or corn or beans that, that hints of it, not wipeouts, but, um, we're seeing it over here. I saw it early in the cover crops, and I saw it in new seeding, and we saw it in our wheat as it started to head out, that you could pick it up in different fields. You hadn't, be paying attention where you're looking, but a little more carryover than I'd anticipated we'd see.
Yeah, I haven't seen too much of that over here, but I definitely do think it's might turn into a year where when we get enough stacked stresses on top of each other, it's going to show up. You can see those fields driving by. It might not be herbicide carryover, but for corn, for example, you take a field that got planted just a little on the wet side, is a little uneven. If it was corn on corn, you add carbon penalty to that. It got a couple extra rains and it's laying wet. That can be a cornfield that looks pretty tough right now. And the same thing on beans. If it was no-till, the stand might be a little thin. Maybe it got replanted, maybe it didn't. But then you take the carbon penalty in that no-till, and cooler May and early June with not as much sunshine, there's just a lot of things that are starting to stack up, and you start to wonder how much of a tag that's going to be at the end of the year.
On your early planted beans, we're seeing over here a tremendous amount of flowering taking place, even last week, that, across the board, seeing those beans that are taking off are really popping the flowers.
Yeah, I saw we had some beans planted March 14th here into some chiseled corn stalks, and I saw the first flower on those beans on May 21st. So
Wow.
that was the earliest I'd seen a flower on a soybean. And since then, yeah, we've added some flowers. We actually got a couple small pods now on the bottom of those beans. But most of the beans planted in March in the first half to probably about the 20th of April are, getting into the flower stage pretty good now.
Yeah, one of the things we've seen, from Central Illinois going east, and a lot of pictures have been sent in the last 2 weeks, and again, tied to weather, tied to carbon penalty, rapid growth, is a little more sulfur and zinc striping than I'm accustomed to seeing. We're more accustomed to see it in some of our sandier soils, but situation where a lot of them we're tracking down, trying to figure out why we're seeing this yellow whorl. The base of the plant is green, the whorl's yellow, got some striping in it. It's traditional sulfur. Growers getting excited, thinking that maybe we should put more on. And in this case, putting on a sulfur deficiency doesn't really fix it. It can sometimes make it worse. But some of it has been traced back to, again, last fall, guys took the ammonium sulfate and the DAP out of their program because of money situation. Forgot to put it back in this spring. You see much for sulfur issues over there in those lighter soils?
Haven't seen a lot yet. I think we'll start to have showing up with these rains and the cooler weather, and we're just kind of now getting into some rapid uptake. So if the sulfur's not there, I expect we would probably see it soon. Did have some calls on zinc deficiencies early, maybe some high phosphorus areas or certain scenarios where that was showing up. But I think you know, going back to kind of our nitrate program and when guys are pulling those and updating their nitrate sheet, that brings back, like you said, did you kick out the fall dry? Are you counting on adding that sulfur in at side dress? And I think that we might have some of that come into play here if guys were planning on side dressing or weren't planning on where are they going to put the sulfur. So just, I guess, a good reminder to make sure we got the whole plan together to get that full rate of nitrogen we were after for our target yield goal and the sulfur with it.
Yeah, making that decision last fall, based on finances and stuff is one thing, but we got to make sure we balance that checkbook right now, or we don't go into rapid growth. We're and boy, at rapid growth is not the time to show sulfur deficiency, right? Because you're setting so much of the yield.
Right. Yeah, we're looking at a lot of times 20, 25 pounds of sulfur for a corn bean rotation and maybe a little more for corn on corn. But, if you're looking at products like mez or elemental sulfur and you only got a portion of that sulfur available, now when we're starting to see, we might be starting to get some mineralized sulfur from our organic matter, but we could be running the tightrope right now if we're counting on those products to produce available sulfate right now.
So, how's your plots looking over there? Seen anything pop out of them?
On the starter fertilizer side, definitely seeing some response there. We've got some checks with and without the in furrow, and so we can just going across some of those fields or visiting those or going across at side dress time, you start to see the areas pop out where you've got a little bit shorter corn, not quite as green, just looks a little less robust. And right next to it and is the bigger, darker green corn. You can definitely tell and go back to the map that was where our starter checks and starter was applied. So I think it could be a pretty good year for starter response based on the early growth that we're seeing.
Seeing anything standing out in the soybean plots as far as I'm sure planting dates showing up at this time.
Yeah, planting dates showing up. Another big thing we've noticed this year is on the seed treatments, just the difference between Alivo and Saltro, especially in areas where you had wetter soil types or poorer drainage. As we go maybe up the hill or into better drainage, not a lot of difference. But when you get into a poor drain scenario or something that laid pretty wet for a while on those early planted beans, those Alivo beans were definitely a little bit reduced stand and a little bit less growth early on. So less stand usually doesn't mean much for yield unless we have to go back and replant. And again, that goes back to some guys in the area or anybody that's using PPO herbicides and Levo and plant early. We're putting those beans in the cool conditions and kind of taking a risk there. And we've had some replant when we put all those things together.
Yeah, and I think also, soybeans just need a little more GDUs, a little higher range, right, compared to corn to get themselves out of the ground. So that left us with soybeans this year, stuck in the ground 20 days. And then that was even at the end of April, right? You think about first part of April being a slow to emerge. We saw a lot of slow emerging beans towards the end of April. The longer they spend in the ground seems the more bruised up they got.
Yeah, and I think it seems like they were in the ground even longer because last year we were so warm in May. These late beans just aren't taking off like they usually do when you plant them the last week of May or last week of April, first part of May.
Seeing any insect pressures?
Haven't seen a whole lot. Little bit of feeding on some soybeans, laying cool and wet, some untreated beans, but for the most part, the cutworm have been pretty light. Haven't had too many calls on cutworm damage. Like you said, the army worms are probably just gearing up based on the GDUs. There's been a lot of the rye and wheat fields chopped recently. So usually we can get some army worms or stuff moving out of them into nearby fields, and we just haven't heard that or seen that yet. So
Yeah, I would tell your customers that the feeding should be starting here this week based on GDUs and our flights. We're going to pay attention to those cover crop fields, your margins where you're bordered up against wheat or tall grass, places like that. We've been pretty quiet on insects too. We have had to spray for cutworm at a couple situations. We had to replant for cutworm because it got away from us, but been pretty quiet. We're at about 50% hatch on rootworms. So here in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we can start doing some of our floats. Normally we would do them a little bit earlier, but again, it's behind in GDUs. Not much we can do if we find a large number of rootworm in the float, but it gives us a way to evaluate our existing rootworm programs and make sure they're holding up. But all in all, it's been kind of an insect friendly year. Definitely got good corn stands and a nitrogen friendly year here. So I think there's a lot of positives out there as we look at this crop banging away. If we just need to get the sun up there and get some heat to it.
yeah, and on the disease front, I know it's still pretty early, but for corn, when we think about the years that we ran into tar spot issues, we've had high humidity and some heavy rains through the last half of June that we're, believe it or not, coming up on now in the next couple weeks. So I think we'll have to pay attention for the next 2 weeks now for some of this corn, especially the early planted corn. If it turns off and kind of stays cloudy and wet and we get some 2 or 3 inch pounding rains, that could be the start of what kicks off the disease. If it turns off hot and dry, maybe not, but that's just something to think about from here going forward
Good
on the
point.
disease front.
Yep. The clock's starting now as far as what kind of pressure we're going to see from especially the tar spot.
Right.
Well, great. Good hearing from you, Matt. And good luck with the plots over there. Guys are side dressing over here right now, working on our side dress plots, and it won't be long. We'll be switching to the wide drop and working on the wide drop plots too. So things are really looking good. We're got the campus is really coming around nice for our Corn College event. So going to have a lot of things to show there. And right now, I'm pretty pumped about the crop we got out there.
Yep. I think the potential is there. For us, a lot of it depends on the rest of the season. So we got to protect the crop and carry it to the finish line.
You bet. Take care, Matt. Thanks.
Yep.
To stay up to date, check out our website at croptechinc.com and subscribe to our podcast, Boots in the Field Report. Keep her safe, keep her moving.